You notice it in the way she speaks, the subtle change in her expressions, the way her gaze no longer lingers the same way it used to. Something has shifted, and you're not imagining it. Modern men are being softened, slowed, and stripped of their natural edge, not through force, but through quiet, almost invisible pressures that punish strength and reward passivity. And while men struggle under this pressure, many women find themselves benefiting quietly. More influence in the relationship, more emotional leverage, more freedom to act without restriction. A man who doubts himself is a man she can guide. A man who over-apologizes is a man she can override. A man who loses his sense of authority becomes someone she no longer needs to respect. The real question is, how did this happen, and how do you break free from the cycle? That's the part most people avoid talking about, but we're going there. You already sense what's unfolding, even if no one has ever said it to your face. Men aren't growing weaker because they've stopped trying. They're becoming weaker because the environment around them is designed to erode what makes them inherently masculine. And the hardest part? Most men don't even realize the shift until they wake up one day feeling like strangers in their own lives. For generations, a man's identity rested on three pillars: leading, providing, and protecting. Not because society forced it on him, but because these roles aligned with his natural wiring. Today, each of those pillars is slowly being chipped away, not through direct attacks, but through cultural messaging that tells him he's too much, too aggressive, or too controlling simply for being himself. That's the essence of emasculation. It doesn't strike like a blow, it leaks slowly, like water seeping into a foundation until the whole structure starts to wobble. This isn't accidental. As masculinity gets reframed as a problem, the world nudges men toward a safer, softer version of themselves, a version that avoids confrontation, avoids leadership, avoids saying no, a version that can be easily replaced, easily influenced, easily managed. You see it in families where men stay silent to prevent conflict, in workplaces where male authority is dismissed as outdated, in media that mocks traditional masculine traits unless they're used purely for entertainment. The more men shrink back, the more room there is for women to step forward, and not always in ways that create balance. Many women recognize this shift instantly and adapt. When a man's presence diminishes, her influence grows, emotionally, domestically, financially. Picture a man coming home each day feeling invisible. His input is ignored, his effort goes unrecognized, his presence seems optional. That's when the spiral begins. He questions himself, apologizes for simply existing, and slowly lets others define his value. Here's the unspoken truth. A man who has weakened becomes far easier to influence than one who stands firm. And many women intuitively know this. When a man loses his position in his own life, women naturally recalibrate, not out of malice, but because human psychology gravitates towards safety and ease with minimal responsibility. A weakened man changes the entire dynamic of a relationship. Modern women crave freedom, emotional freedom, financial freedom, lifestyle freedom. But freedom comes with accountability, and when a man loses his leverage, accountability vanishes. She can make choices without challenge, shape the relationship without negotiation, and navigate life without compromise. Why should she adapt when nothing resists her? When a man loses influence, respect fades. That's the turning point. A woman doesn't need to raise her voice or manipulate overtly. The dynamic shifts on its own. She becomes the emotional anchor. She becomes the decision maker. She sets the tone because the man standing beside her no longer sets boundaries for himself. This pattern isn't new. Historically, women depended on strong men for survival. But once societal systems stepped in to provide stability, protection, and resources, dependence wasn't required anymore. What happens next is strategic adaptation. Women start optimizing their lives, making choices that benefit them emotionally and materially. A man without authority becomes someone they can navigate around, rather than a partner they must stand beside. Picture it. A man constantly adjusting his tone, monitoring her moods, apologizing for things he didn't do, all in the name of peace. He believes he's being loving, but she sees something else entirely, a man losing himself to earn approval. The moment she senses that shift, respect diminishes, attraction dulls, and influence becomes effortless. She doesn't need to dominate. He's already relinquishing control himself. That's why so many women today are comfortable with men who hesitate, doubt themselves, or are overly accommodating. It grants them emotional mobility. They can act without consequence, withdraw affection to guide behavior, and leverage conflict to center attention on their needs. This isn't about blame or labeling women as manipulative. It's about the reality of human psychology and relational dynamics. When a man abdicates his natural role, intentionally or not, the balance tips. Women adapt because it's natural to optimize one's position within any system. And for men, the cost of losing that internal authority isn't just about respect. It's about attraction, influence, and the ability to maintain equilibrium in their lives. So the key isn't confrontation or resentment, it's awareness. Understanding how this quiet erosion occurs, recognizing the subtle pressures that encourage passivity, and reclaiming the pillars of identity that form the foundation of a man's confidence and influence. Because when a man knows his value, when he remembers to lead, provide, and protect, not in an aggressive or controlling way, but as a core part of his identity, the dynamic shifts back toward balance. That's when respect is earned, attraction is maintained, and relationships function as they were meant to, as partnerships between equals. And that's the truth Hidden Waters wants every man to recognize. The quiet, gradual shift that robs a man of authority doesn't just affect him, it changes every interaction, every relationship, every dynamic in ways most never see until it's too late. But with awareness, understanding, and deliberate action, it's possible to reverse the drift, reclaim your presence, and restore balance to your life and your relationships. Because here's the hidden mechanism. A man without leverage becomes someone a woman no longer feels compelled to respect. And once respect fades, the entire relationship tilts quietly but decisively in her favor. This isn't about cruelty or manipulation. It's about the way power operates in human dynamics. When one partner loses influence, the other naturally gains it. Women, consciously or not, often benefit from this shift, not because they set out to exploit it, but because a vacuum of authority creates space they can occupy. To understand why so many men feel disempowered today, you have to trace back to the moment when the balance of support fundamentally changed. It was the moment when a system, not a partner, became the primary provider. This wasn't just a bureaucratic adjustment or a political decision, it was a psychological earthquake, quietly rearranging the foundations of male-female dynamics. When welfare programs expanded in the mid-20th century, the intention wasn't to weaken men, but that was exactly what happened. Suddenly, women could access financial stability without relying on a man. The message, subtle but unmistakable, was clear. If security is guaranteed by the system, a man is no longer indispensable. Some interpretations of this took it to extremes. In certain cases, a man's very presence could disqualify a household from receiving assistance. Imagine the emotional impact of that. A father standing at his own doorway, no longer seen as a source of protection or provision, but as an obstacle to survival. Families weren't failing because men lacked effort. They were being incentivized to step back. And here's where human psychology does its work. Once a woman sees that stability can exist independently of a man, her perception of male value subtly recalibrates. This isn't intentional or malicious. It's simply the way the mind aligns incentives with outcomes. Leadership, discipline, even emotional guidance, once central to a man's worth, become optional. Commitment no longer requires respect. The system has replaced the man as the reliable constant, and he moves from being essential to being negotiable. In that environment, men begin to question their relevance. When the world subtly signals that he is no longer required, many start to internalize that narrative. Meanwhile, women, consciously or unconsciously, accept the same reality. The system, not the man, becomes the dependable entity. And here lies the truth most avoid acknowledging. When a man is displaced by structure, A woman's perception of his worth diminishes, not because she is unkind, but because psychology always follows incentives. Nowhere is this emasculation more quietly ruthless than in child support and custody. It is often here that a man first learns the stark difference between legal obligation and emotional authority. Child support is framed as noble, as ensuring a child's well-being, yet the emotional fracture it creates is profound. When a father provides financially but is denied meaningful access to his child, he becomes a participant in a life he can't fully inhabit. Milestones pass without him. Decisions are made without consultation. His presence is reduced to a footnote, and the system communicates a brutal truth. Your value is measured in dollars, not in the role you play as a parent. This is where identity erosion begins, not because men are unwilling to provide, but because the structure prioritizes legal compliance over emotional connection. Fathers lose influence, access, and daily bonds that once defined them. Yet their responsibilities remain mandatory, enforceable, and punishable if unmet. For women, the shift happens almost effortlessly. Guaranteed support removes the need to negotiate emotional cooperation. She can make decisions without resistance, manage the household independently, and hold legal advantage simply because of structural design. Leverage emerges unconsciously, a byproduct of the system's incentives rather than personal intent. A man in this position experiences more than financial strain. He experiences erasure from his child's daily life, from the decision-making processes that once defined him, from the identity he built around competence, provision, and protection. Emotional participation is stripped away while obligations remain, and this is a psychological double bind. The man is required to contribute, yet the very act of contributing underscores his displacement. Understanding this dynamic is critical to understanding why so many men today feel displaced. Historically, men earned respect through competence, discipline, and productivity, both at home and at work. These arenas provided tangible evidence of value: a stable household, successful career, and the ability to protect and provide. But as these spaces shifted, the foundational signals of respect and relevance shifted with them. Workplaces became less dependent on traditional masculine traits, and domestic structures were increasingly supported by systems that diminished the need for male authority. The result is a slow, almost imperceptible erosion of identity. A man can still work, provide, and strive, yet the structures that once validated those efforts no longer recognize them in the same way. Authority, once natural and automatic, must now be asserted deliberately, or it disappears entirely. Meanwhile, women adapt effortlessly to the new landscape. When a man's presence diminishes, their autonomy and influence naturally expand. Emotional, financial, and domestic power grows without conscious intent simply because the environment rewards it. This is the invisible architecture of modern relationships. Men aren't failing because they lack effort or intention. They are reacting to a landscape that has shifted beneath their feet. And unless they recognize the forces at play, the systems, the incentives, the subtle social pressures, they remain trapped in a cycle of self-doubt, reduced influence, and fading identity. But awareness changes everything. Understanding how these mechanisms operate allows a man to reclaim authority, reestablish relevance, and restore balance in both his personal life and his relationships. Because here's the final truth: identity and leverage are inseparable. When a man reclaims his role as a participant rather than an observer, when he asserts presence alongside responsibility, respect naturally follows. When the foundation is restored, the power dynamic stabilizes, and relationships function as they were always meant to, on a basis of mutual recognition, influence, and authentic partnership. But here's the problem: the erosion doesn't stop at the workplace. It carries over into the home because confidence isn't compartmentalized. Masculine presence isn't something a man can switch off when he walks into the office and suddenly turn back on at the front door. Once it begins to weaken, it weakens everywhere. Workplaces began rewarding caution over decisiveness, diplomacy over direction, emotional sensitivity over clarity. None of these traits are inherently negative, but they aren't the instincts that traditionally define male effectiveness. When a man enters a space designed to suppress his natural drive and assertiveness, he holds back. He second-guesses himself. He measures every word before it leaves his mouth. And a man who hesitates slowly stops feeling like the man he once was. The pressure to not dominate, not offend, not assert too strongly conditions him into blending in rather than standing out. And the more he blends in, the more invisible he becomes, not just at work, but at home. Because the truth is, women sense this shift immediately. When she feels her partner withdrawing, subconsciously she steps forward, not because she wants control, but because influence never sits idle. Someone always fills the vacuum, and the moment a man hesitates, she recalibrates her role. She starts making decisions, handling logistics, organizing the household, initiating the structure he once provided. Slowly, the dynamic flips. He's no longer the anchor, he becomes the accessory. He's no longer the direction, he's the passenger. The home he built and nurtured continues to function, but he feels like a guest at his own table. His authority evaporated because he stopped exercising it consistently in every aspect of his life. Here's what most people won't admit. Influence outside the home inevitably shapes authority inside it. This doesn't happen through conflict, argument, or force. It happens quietly, silently, piece by piece, until one day a man wakes up and realizes he's no longer leading himself. That's what emasculation truly is. It's not a single blow. It's a psychological unraveling. It begins with losing a role, then confidence, then the freedom to speak authentically. A man who once moved with clarity now moves with caution, hyper-aware of reactions, particularly hers. He over-explains. He over-apologizes. He overcorrects, not to be kind, but to avoid friction. And every time he sacrifices authenticity for approval, he teaches her an unintended lesson. My boundaries are negotiable, my needs can wait, my voice doesn't matter. And once she learns that lesson, the dynamic changes profoundly. Women who naturally lean toward influence sense the gap immediately, not as an opportunity to support him, but as an opening to guide him. When a man loses his internal compass, her emotional leverage becomes formidable. A look of disappointment and he adjusts instantly. A withdrawal of affection and he panics. A subtle expression of frustration and he bends overnight. This isn't always manipulation. It's simply the psychology of a man who has become moldable. A man desperate to be accepted becomes addicted to harmony. He believes compliance will restore respect, that minimizing himself will prove value, that softness will rebuild connection. But here's the harsh truth he doesn't see. Every attempt to earn approval confirms the very thing he fears. Women don't follow men who chase them. They don't admire men who abandon their own standards. They don't feel anchored by men who need permission to exist. And that is where emotional exploitation happens, often unconsciously. She realizes she can guide his decisions simply through tone, win arguments with silence, control boundaries and structure without overt effort. A relationship built solely on her terms becomes one where he slowly disappears. By the time he notices, he is living in a version of himself he doesn't recognize, passive, anxious, disconnected from instinct, separated from his own authority. That's why the warning is so sharp. When a man stops leading himself, every woman around him begins leading him, whether she admits it or not. Nature abhors a vacuum, and when power is surrendered, someone else inevitably claims it. In today's world, that vacuum doesn't just exist in homes, it exists in the marketplace of attention. Men who have been emotionally weakened, stripped of direction, drained of confidence, become easy targets. Because once a man loses the sense that he matters in his real life, he starts seeking validation anywhere he can feel seen. And the digital world is filled with women ready to provide it, for a price. This isn't a question of morality, it's a question of psychology. A man who once drew value from leadership, presence, and purpose now attempts to recreate that feeling through digital affirmation, likes, comments, fleeting attention. He substitutes real influence with digital breadcrumbs, mistaking visibility for validation, presence for worth, and the cycle compounds. The more he trades authentic authority for approval, the more the environment trains him to stay small, compliant, and unassertive. The impact reaches deeper than social media. It infects the rhythm of everyday life, the subtle currents of decision-making, and the emotional architecture of relationships. When a man's confidence falters externally, it diminishes internally, reshaping his interactions, undermining his instincts, and signaling, often without words, that he is no longer the one setting the tone. And when that happens, the woman closest to him, whether intentionally or unconsciously, fills the space. She makes decisions he once would have made. She organizes life he once would have led. She becomes the anchor because he has stepped aside. And here's the critical point. This is not about blame. It's about understanding the mechanism. When the environment encourages a man to shrink, the natural consequence is that influence will shift elsewhere. The solution isn't external confrontation, it's internal reclamation. Authority, confidence, and presence are not granted. They are exercised, maintained, and defended within every domain of life. Once a man reconnects with his internal compass, asserts his boundaries, and acts with deliberate influence, the dynamic reverses. Respect is earned again, stability is restored, and the relationship returns to its intended balance, a partnership built on mutual recognition, shared influence, and authentic presence. But even beyond the home and workplace, the erosion of a man's authority reaches into places he might never expect. A smile, a message, a flicker of attention, small gestures that feel like connection, but aren't connection at all. Women who understand this dynamic, whether consciously or instinctively, can turn it into opportunity. They monetize what weakened men crave most: acknowledgement. A man who has lost his emotional footing becomes predictable. He will pay to feel seen. He will pay to feel chosen. He will pay to feel relevant again, not because he is reckless, but because he is starving for validation. Meanwhile, the woman on the other side doesn't have to offer commitment, respect, or partnership. She doesn't even need to know his name. All she provides is the illusion of intimacy long enough to keep him engaged. Picture him late at night, scrolling, telling himself this is harmless, while deep down it fills the emptiness created when he stopped feeling significant in his own life. Every dollar he sends, every subscription renewed, every minute consumed feeds the same truth. He's attempting to buy back a sense of worth he once had, but lost somewhere along the way. For her, it's simple economics. The weaker he is, the stronger her position becomes. The lonelier he feels, the more valuable his attention. The less empowered he is, the more she benefits from offering a curated version of desire he cannot access in reality. This doesn't make her malicious. It makes the system effective. It rewards those who can tap into male vulnerability. It encourages leaning into fantasy because fantasy pays far more than reality ever could. And here is the line most men don't want to face. If someone can profit from your loneliness, they never need your strength. That is the final stage of emasculation, when a man's need for connection becomes someone else's revenue stream, and his longing becomes their gain. By now, the pattern is clear. None of these shifts occurred overnight, and none of them were accidental. Piece by piece, system by system, expectation by expectation, men were pushed further from the center of their own lives. And as that space opened, women, consciously or unconsciously, stepped in. Some benefited emotionally, some financially, some simply adapted to the way the world rewarded them. But here is what cannot be forgotten. A weakened man is not a natural state. It is a conditioned one. Culture may attempt to soften you. Systems may try to sideline you. People may accept a version of you that barely resembles who you are. But none of that has the final say unless you allow it. Because the core truth remains untouched by politics, trends, or opinions. A woman cannot emasculate a man who refuses to hand over his power. Your strength is not stolen. It is surrendered. And if you surrendered it, you can reclaim it. Reclaiming your boundaries is power. Reclaiming your voice is power. Reclaiming your standards, discipline, and direction is power. That is how you rebuild the man you were always meant to be. You don't need the world to shift before you stand taller. You don't need anyone's approval before you speak with conviction. You don't need permission to take your rightful place in your own life again. You cannot rewrite the entire system today, but you can rewrite yourself. And sometimes that alone is enough to change everything around you. If this message resonates, then stay with me. Subscribe so you don't walk this journey alone. Like and share this video if it gave you clarity you didn't have before. Comment below. Tell me where in your life you're ready to take your power back. This is your turning point. And once you claim it, you're not going back to the man you used to be.